The strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. Thucydides. The Daily Grind, Chapter 131. Once upon a time, James had dreaded high school. If this came as a shock to anyone he knew, he'd be exceptionally surprised. Some of his current friends had even been with him through the experience, and they almost universally agreed it hadn't been great. Almost, because JP was an eternal outlier in any poll of their group, and he'd actually had quite a lot of fun in high school, though James was of the opinion that if JP hadn't spent his youth tricking kids into doing his homework and convincing teachers to let him bail on class, then his high school career would have been a lot different in nostalgia quality. The point was, walking through the doors of a high school wasn't an action James associated with good vibes. But it was, he would readily admit, kind of satisfying to do it as an adult, and also as someone with a level of prowess to shape the world around him. There was a security guard standing by the doors, watching the flow of students who were currently mid-lunch. It was the same old guy who they'd identified themselves, falsely, as the FBI to, back when they were first investigating here. He was watching James and his companions as they came in with a wary eye, probably not recognizing them right away through the masks. "Rufus," James greeted him, the old man's name easy enough for him to remember for a certain reason. "How's the place been?" The lines around the man's eyes lit up in recognition when James greeted him. "Oh, agents," he rumbled out with a casual familiarity that was completely unearned. "It's been quiet, mostly just making sure the kids keep their masks on. Is there—" He cleared his throat, looking around and needlessly lowering his voice against the dull roar of hundreds of students talking, eating, and yelling. "Is there something going on again?" "Shouldn't be anything serious," James said. "We're just here to check on things," he half-lied. They were, absolutely, here to check up on things. It's just that thing that they were here to check on was whether or not the hostile living place under the building was still eating high schoolers. Which was, a mite bit more serious than basically anything the FBI normally got up to. The weirdest part of this whole thing, as far as James figured, was that he wasn't exactly entirely lying about being an FBI agent anymore. Mostly lying, but not entirely. And the second weirdest thing was that he thought that was weirder than the dungeon itself. The last year and change of his life had been pretty malicious about recalibrating his gauge of what was and wasn't strange. Extra-dimensional arena that offered a marketing class as a reward for survival? Normal. Working for the government? Strange. "He's booked," Sarah muttered in James's ear as they politely nodded to Rufus and headed down toward the school's lower level. "What?" James took a second to process that. Booked, like the books from the dungeon they were headed to that were offered as rewards, usually rewards for murder. That was, in a lot of ways, very concerning. "How do you know?" "A couple perception orbs helping, how he was standing, the changes in how he greeted you." Sarah spoke in a low tone. There were still students around lining the halls here in small clusters as they ate lunch and took a reprieve from their own daily toils. "He's too confident. He's thinking he's pulling a fast one on you, which means either our cover is blown or he's got some kind of power. Book makes the most sense." James closed his eyes and considered the man they just passed. Shit, you're right. I've seen that look before," he muttered. "That's the expression Frank always had on when he thought he was getting away with something." "How is the old guy doing these days, anyway?" Daniel asked, venom in his voice as he followed. "Still a bitter asshole?" "I think that's the most angry I've ever heard you," Sarah noted. "Also, he's still in prison. Our casual subversion of the justice system is working out." "You make that sound like a really bad thing," James trailed off, and then cleared his throat. "Okay, yeah," he resignedly admitted. The three of them rounded the last corner and started descending a ramp that wasn't normally there. As they did so, their ears picked up on the sudden hush that ran through the hall, the whispers of students that were watching, trying their best not to let on. James could feel the prickling on his arms as he passed between the real school and the other world below it. At first pass, Sarah and Daniel were not the first choice for a scout team. Even with the ethereal Pathfinder tagging along, tethered to Daniel's brain, that still left a solid 75% of their party in the category of humans who had been shot within the last couple months. And yes, Daniel hadn't been shot anywhere critical, and Sarah had the ability to recover absurdly quickly thanks to this very dungeon's magic, but that still didn't leave James feeling comfortable with it. Still, they were who was available, and despite his promise to his boyfriend to let him fight rats in the basement, Anesh had rapidly gotten distracted with helping research renovate their basement space into something that was usable again. So 3 humans with itching scars walked down the stone slope, carrying duffel bags full of tools that might not work, feeling simultaneously unprepared and oddly confident. "Hey, Lua," James greeted the middle-aged woman who was sitting at the threshold. She had a heavy black cardigan on, her hair pulled up in its usual bun, sitting on a confiscated chair from the school's library, reading a book on the history of warfare. Her chair was at the bottom of the ramp, pushed back against the wall right next to a blue metal door with a rusted push bar on it. "James," the school counselor replied with a nod, one-handedly closing her book around a paper strip with a snap as she looked up. "Welcome back." "I've been back for a while. Oh, you mean here specifically." James flushed a bit and looked away. "Sorry, what are you doing down here?" "Making sure no one goes in," Lewis said matter-of-factly. "It's still the same place, isn't it?" she asked. "That's what we're here to find out," Sarah cut in with her usual cheerful flair. "Do you want to come with us?" Lewis smiled a soft smile, visible in her eyes even with her mouth obscured by a pink and purple flower-patterned mask, and gave a single heavy exhalation. "No, no, I am not a soldier," she told them in a voice that was equal parts kind and sad. "No matter what the students think of me, I'm just here to watch the door." What the students thought of her, as far as James could gather, was that she was some kind of manifested guardian spirit that could snap people's necks by pointing at them. And while that was only about 30% correct, no one really had the inclination or ability to get a high school worth of students to change their minds. The fact that she stuck around after the building had been turned into a war zone, and kept her job as guidance counselor, just kind of added to her local mythology. James was almost jealous of her growing status as folk hero, but more than that he was happily amused that she was recognized for the monumental effort she'd put into saving lives during the fight here. And also that the Order had someone keeping an eye on things here. "So has anyone peeked inside?" he asked, eyeing the overtly suspicious door. No one wants to risk that it's a teleporter," Lua explained. "Imagine touching the door and then you're inside. Seems like the kind of trick the sewer would pull." "Fair," James agreed. He readjusted his grip on the handle of the duffel bag in his hand. "All right, you two ready?" "As we can be," Daniel grumbled. "You sure we shouldn't be doing this with a small army? We could get one of the snakes in here." "Probably a good idea, but it's fine," James replied. "We've got a telepad. If we need to, we can bail when it gets unsafe." He rolled his head from side to side, eliciting a popping crack from his neck. "Let's see what's in there." Sarah set a hand on his shoulder, and farther back Daniel did the same with her. James reached forward and touched the door, tensing up in preparation for a possible teleport into an angry sewer dimension. Nothing happened. He let out a soft sigh and pushed at the bar, having to use quite a bit of force to get the rusted metal to move into place. And then, with a grinding screech, it swung open on false ancient hinges, and the 3 of them stepped forward into the dungeon's territory. The Order of Endless Rooms was, as far as they knew, the foremost experts in dungeon physiology. Barring a few outliers like the old gun, they could safely say they knew more than status quo ever did. They certainly knew more than the more mundane government agencies like the FBI, who, for some reason, had an organizational problem acknowledging that the supernatural existed. Between operational experience, a series of inquiring totems that Momo kept developing, and the existence of a dungeon that was friendly to their organization, at least in part, they had multiple sources of data that were more or less capable of letting them come up with working theories. They'd come a long way from James trying to figure out if staplers could be friends, and yet they still didn't really know a lot of stuff. They knew a dungeon was a living place. There was an intelligence that built, maintained, and populated that place. It absolutely was not a human intelligence. Dungeons didn't appear to get tired or bored, ever, and Momo's totems had confirmed that at least. What they didn't know was a lot of the stuff about the central intelligences themselves. Did they have a brain of some kind? A physical object that housed their mind? The sewer seemed to, but maybe it was a special case. Were they distributed through the entire structure that they built? What did they want? What method did they have to communicate? Did they have a society? Did they have friends? They knew that there was at least one other dungeon out there that they hadn't seen because it had called them through the phones of Officium Mundi. It had spoken in riddles, but it had called the office its brother. Did dungeons have families? One thing they knew, through their connection to Clutter Ascent, the dungeon in the attic of a house the Order now had listed in its growing spreadsheet of assets, was that dungeons kinda needed to challenge people. Not hurt them, not kill them, though apparently that was part of it, but no matter how friendly or kind a dungeon grew to be, it had to offer a challenge. And these challenges almost always came with rewards in some way. That part also seemed to be compulsory, either instinctive or a biological impulse, like how humans couldn't really choose to turn off their lungs. Momo called this process the harvest of conceptual weight. Anesh called this process poorly defined and in need of categorization and study. Also not what Momo said. They also knew that the life of dungeons created wasn't just an extension of the dungeon itself. Most of their working data came from the office, where they had multiple different forms of life, multiple categories of life to look at, but there were other examples too. Dungeons could make living things that were intelligent, and they could find ways to impose control on that intelligence, but it never seemed to be quite perfect. Things in the office made with yellow orbs acted like wildlife, untamed, often dangerous, but not evil, usually hungry. Camercondas and a few other forms, made with green orbs, were referred to as puppets by the smaller forms of yellow life, and it seemed like the dungeon had a stronger finger on the scales of how they behaved, especially when it came to fighting intruders. But removed from the physical boundary and the control of the dungeon, they were people, with as much free will as anyone else. Infomorphs were another form of life they'd run across in the office. Life made of an idea that thought itself, that grew and shared itself with others. They were impressive and scary in some ways, and they appeared to just be the surface of non-material life, since the Order had also encountered something called authorities when they dealt with status quo. If Infomorphs were living ideas, authorities seemed to be living commands. Not that they had any living ones left to examine. They knew a few other things, too. They knew that dungeons could send their creations out into the real world. They knew some of them did this to erase memories or kill perceived threats. They knew that they weren't passive places. Dungeons were active operatives. They knew that dungeons had to be challenged in some way. It was how they fed, essentially. And while the ones they knew of didn't need it very often, or maybe had their own tricks for getting that sustenance, they did seem to need it. And so, they could extrapolate that if a dungeon was left untouched for too long, it would be faced with a choice. Quietly starve, leaving a husk of itself barely tethered to the physical world, or take one last risk and send out its agents to bring it what was needed. This was why, even though they were all still recovering, James had made the call that it was time to revisit the Akashic Sewer, because no one wanted to risk another outbreak. Even though the last one had been outside influence, it had still killed a lot of people, and a repeat of that was unacceptable. So since they didn't know how to kill a dungeon outright, if that was even an option, the Delve team pushed through the door to fight monsters, collect magic, and get out alive, turning the pressure valve just enough that it wouldn't be a problem for a while. The room the door opened into was a circular chamber, lit by sickly, glowing yellow bulbs on the ceiling, and mostly made out of stained concrete. The instant all three of them were in, the door slammed shut behind them, the line of its edge merging seamlessly with the wall and leaving just another part of the gray stone where they had once been a portal to the outside world. There was graffiti on the walls, much of it obscured by the very overt infomorphs that lived here and tried to eat names. There was a rusted drain in the middle of the room, with a foul and rotten smell pouring out of it. And aside from that, not much else. No creatures waiting in ambush, no sludge traps, nothing crawling on the ceiling, which James made damn sure of. Just an empty room. 3 holes in the wall led to pitch-black tunnels, the sticky light of the room not moving beyond the threshold. A cluster of bright red-shelled roach-like things scattered as they walked in. The lack of a nauseating transition from Earth to this place was appreciated. The tunnel had been fun, for certain values of the word, but James preferred a door. "Gear check," James called as the three of them spread out a bit and dropped their bags. He could feel his own had been lightened. The barrier was still in place, but it had changed. Instead of pulling, it had just removed. Here was something else they sort of knew about dungeons. They all seemed to have some kind of defensive shell. The attic had projected a fear field, the office had some kind of time compression, and the school's sewer? It built restrictions for itself. From what they could tell, it was pretty dang close to a list of things that just weren't allowed in a school. This was one of those things that didn't fully make sense, because if you tried to come in holding a knife, the thing just hit the floor outside the entrance and you ended up unarmed. But once you were in the sewer, there were ample opportunities to relieve the local wildlife of a blade, and you could walk around stabbing things with that one as much as you wanted. But whatever the hypocrisy of the Akashic Sewer, the rules mostly lined up like this. No weapons, no electronics, no toys, no outside food. Notably, laptops were exempt as long as they didn't have games on them, with the exception of Minesweeper. Other exemptions included water bottles, regardless of if they were full of water or not, and skulljack braids. The running theory was that that last thing counted as a medical device in some way, but no one wanted to make a judgment call on that and risk being wrong if somebody with a pacemaker wandered in and just had their heart ripped out. "Gun's gone," Daniel reported, sorting through his bag. "Sword's gone. Armor's here, though. Coffee's here. Oh, and this." He held up a pen that they'd liberated from Officium Mundi that, while technically still a pen, used a kind of highly concentrated acid instead of ink. "Same stuff missing here," Sarah chimed in, smothering a choked cough. "I hate the smell. It's eating through the mask filter." All of them had chosen to wear thicker filter masks today, but as Sarah had said, it wasn't doing much against the smell aside from making a fashion statement. "Weirdly, the ball bearings are gone, but the stakes are still here." Her bag had contained a small jar of the metal orbs, perfectly suited to be ammunition for her organic ability to shape magnetic fields. It had also contained a trio of sharpened wooden spikes, which were modified to be magnetically charged themselves for the same reason. "Maybe they were too close to ammo," James suggested, pulling the different pieces of armor padding out of his bag and starting to strap them to his arms and legs. "Oh, telepad's still here. Good." He noted that as he found it in the bottom of the bag. "My rope is gone, though." James sulked, even as he pulled a trio of wooden rods out and started screwing them together to form a staff. There was a broom head in the bag, too, just to drive home the point to the dungeon that this was a cleaning tool and not a weapon, but he left it in there. He didn't need that part. "Could be. Hey, help me with this," Sarah said, turning toward him and presenting the straps on the back of her body armor for James to pull into place and hook together as she pointedly ignored his comment about the rope. "Daniel, you need help?" "We've got it," the younger man said simply, a dusty golden glow dispersing off his back as Pathfinder helped him don his own suit. "All right, ready?" James asked again. "Ready, set," the other two replied. Sarah and James clipped pen lights to their shoulders, thin beams of white light giving a small amount of illumination to their surroundings. Meanwhile, around Daniel, Pathfinder spread wings a couple inches, throwing off an orange glow that lit the area around him. They picked a tunnel at random, and they started walking. Their boots made echoing thuds as the three of them stepped into the tunnel. The walls had a rough concrete to them, but large chunks of both the wall and floors were often replaced by clusters of pipes. Most of them metal, copper or rusted iron, though there were a few more modern-looking plastic tubes as well. The light they had on them seemed to be almost strangled by the dark, only getting them a few feet of vision before they died out. But it was enough to safely walk, and they made far better time than when James's crew had come in here the first time. Every now and then the group paused to listen to the rattling of something crawling through the pipes overhead, or the rush of some kind of liquid around them. More than a few times, a bug the size of a human fist would scuttle out from a crack and dart toward their ankles. None of them ever made it far. Not a single one of the people here had any interest in letting a magically spawned cockroach climb up their legs, and a heavy stomp was more than enough to deal with the things. Every time they killed one, a small sputter of red sparks would light up the corpse for a half second before being drawn into whoever had killed it. James had checked when he came in, and after a familiar brief flash of pain, had gotten a number to appear around the back of his hand. The sparks counted kills, sort of, and now they knew that they didn't reset, no matter how long you were out of the dungeon. So if nothing else, they'd have enough to leave through a gate if they needed to. The last time James had fought this place, he had killed enough things to have quite a stockpile. After a half hour of walking in a mostly straight line, they came across an intersection in the tunnel. A simple T, with the wall in front of them having a rusted door set into it. It was also the first place they'd seen with its own light in the whole time they'd been walking, a puddle of some kind of aggressively glowing blue liquid forming a pool underneath a leaking pipe that it kept dripping from. Alright, left or right? Also don't touch that. James realized the words were absolutely pointless as soon as he said them. None of the people were amateurs or idiots. These were experienced delvers, one of whom had technically been doing it longer than he had. I choose door, Sarah said. That's where the green points come from, yeah? As far as James knew, yes. There was one way to earn green sparks, and that was by answering the cryptic and very hostile questions the dungeon carved into the walls of some of the side rooms. While the red sparks were used to open doors, the green ones were used to open the closest thing to treasure chests that any dungeon he'd seen had so far. You good with that? James asked Daniel, cocking his head to look back at the one bringing up their rear guard. Yeah, nothing's been following us, and Path says this place isn't changing the walls, so I don't mind if we take a minute. Besides, I kind of want to see what sort of lesson I'd get from this place, and that means we have to be a little greedy, right? Daniel answered with a shrug. It's not like it's hard for us to just run if we need to. This place isn't actually hard to navigate once you know the tricks. The trick, mostly, was to have a source of light and not panic. Eventually you'd find yourself at an exit arena, and then all you had to do was kill your way out. Not that such a thing was exactly easy, but a strike team of experienced delvers had a hell of a lot more of a chance than a group of scared students. Alright, Daniel, push it open from that side. Sarah, take the left. If anything moves, stab it. Ready? James felt like half the words he'd said so far down here were to ask everyone if they were ready. He almost laughed as they got into position, but then remembered that this place was, more than any dungeon they'd ever seen, really trying to kill people. If anything called for playing it safe, it was this dark and moldy pit in the ground. James stood in the middle of the intersection, one foot on the jagged step that led to the door, while Daniel braced himself against the wall, and fed enough red sparks into the handle to convince it to crack open. He had his makeshift staff held out in front of him, prepared to smack anything that charged out of the doorway once it was opened. He was in absolutely no way prepared for a trio of elongated human arms to burst out of the door. They were easily several meters long each, with gooey flesh that practically dripped off of them, shimmering translucently in the different forms of light that the delvers had brought. Multiple elbow joints on each one of them that seemed to not be limited to a single direction as the things jerked and thrashed across the floor, leaving a trail of their own melting skin. In an ideal world, James would have reacted with the reflexes of an action movie protagonist. But even having intentionally prepared for a fight, the only thing he managed before one of the hands wrapped around his own wrist and started applying force was to scream out a panicked yelp. The second hand clamped onto his shoulder, and James jerked backward, peeling away a wet patch of skin from the thing as he tore himself away from it. He brought the heavy wooden staff he had down on the one that was trying to readjust its grip and heard the sickening pop of bones cracking. But his angle was wrong for this sort of sudden proximity, and he found himself pinwheeling an arm as he fell backward onto his ass, the plastic shell of his body armor eating the impact on the ragged concrete. Through the rushing noise in his ears, James heard Daniel and Sarah yelling something indistinct. His heart started hammering in panicked fear as hands with a grip stronger than they should have possibly had started clawing their way up his armor, closing in on his neck and unprotected face. Then, one of them jerked sideways as Daniel brought the heel of his boot down on a joint so hard that it popped apart, splattering yellow pus that smelled like year-old eggs onto the floor and up James's leg. The disconnected hand instantly went slack, and James brought his other hands up to grab the last one that was trying to get to his eyes. It had too many fingers. He realized the information as his hands lashed onto it. If that was the only thing going on, it would have been horrifying. But as it stood, he had bigger things to worry about, so he grabbed one of the thumbs and a couple of the fingers that were trying to seek his eyes, with both hands finding as solid a grip as he could through the gloves and the slippery, melting skin of his attacker. Then James yanked his arms apart as hard as he could in opposite directions. The arm tore in half like wet cardboard, a slurping sound accompanying the fountain of yellow pus down the front of his armor. Then it started crying, the noise like a human baby as it screamed and wailed, whipping back and forth as it slithered away from James's body. A magnetic snapping noise in the air, the crunch of wood on bone, and then everything went silent. James's wild yelling trailed off into the quiet as he realized the arms were not moving anymore. Rolling to his stomach and pushing himself off the jagged floor with his gloved palms, he brought himself back to his feet and looked around. Daniel was dry heaving onto the side of the hallway, the smell having gotten so far up his nose it felt like he was drowning in it. The arms lay limp across the concrete in pipes. Sarah standing in front of the door, arms raised, panting in exertion. James stepped up beside her, keeping an eye out around them and trying not to gag. In the beam of the flashlight he could see through the doorway that the wooden spikes she'd fired had found purchase in some kind of hanging bulb of flesh and slime. The arms had been growing out of it, and there were more attached to the thing that simply weren't long enough to reach past the door. Now it lay dripping that same pus, as well as a soft fountain of red sparks that slowly flooded into Sarah's still raised hand. "Okay," James eventually said, having to try the word a few times before he could speak without coughing in disgust. "Alright, so, that's just the fucking worst thing down here so far," he settled on. "Congratulations, you have won. There is no prize." "My prize is that I'm going to stay out of here while you two check the room," Sarah informed him matter-of-factly. "Because fuck everything about that." She pointed an accusatory finger through the doorway. Neither of the guys argued with her. The room itself was like the waiting room for a principal's office, only without any windows, and the chairs were turned piles of sharp kindling, and also the carpet had rotted into black sludge. It just had the feeling, though. The walls had words scraped into them, and in the light from the single flickering bulb overhead, James and Daniel read through them. There were a couple of math questions, word problems about how many people died in a certain burning building. One thing that seemed to be asking how many children perished in the book The Lord of the Flies, and a much larger diagram that seemed to show a person having their organs ritually torn out. Daniel answered the math problems quickly enough, and James took a minute to run through the plot of the book he'd liked least in high school before giving an answer to that one as well. Then the two of them stood looking at the last diagram together. Does it want us to identify the different organs?" James asked. "Maybe it's art. Are we supposed to know if that's cubism?" Daniel wondered himself. They waited, hopeful, but no green sparks came to life at his words. "Alright, fine, organs," he conceded. "Well, that's the heart, obviously. Lungs, kidney." James pointed and labeled pieces of the pictured person. "What else?" "Eyes are organs," Daniel offered. James shrugged and tried it. "Okay, heart, lungs, kidney, eye. Yeah." That was enough for the biology portion of the quiz, apparently. A dozen radioactive green sparks burning to life and flowing into James's hand as he named pieces of the dismembered person. "Great," he said. "Let's get the hell out of here." No one argued. But even though they all now desperately wanted to take a 2-hour-long scalding hot shower and use more soap in one go than the state of Ohio used in a year, they still took their time to move safely through the corridor. They had the telepad, they could leave at any time, but if they took their time, played it safe, and found an exit room, they could trade the answers they had for the simple, if grim, questions. And the books that they were rewarded would represent a large spike in consistent strength and survivability for the Order as a whole. So they kept at it, picking off bugs, and at one point one of the weird hairless rat things that lunged down from the ceiling. Avoiding the dripping fluids and drifting spores. None of them talked much, but even though it would have been a distraction from the smell, no one wanted to spend the extra breath in this place. They tackled a couple more rooms, neither of them with any arm bulbs. They ran down the tunnels at a reckless speed when one of those balls of skulls and screams made itself known behind them. They waited patiently as Daniel carved his way through a patch of wall that didn't fit the rest of the place, hoping to find some kind of magic item buried there. They helped Daniel make sure he'd gotten all of the swarming bugs off of himself after it turned out that patch was a nest and not hidden treasure. Eventually, they came to a point where the tunnel stopped being quite so dark. An orange light that looked almost welcoming at the mouth of the tunnel where it opened into a wider room. "Ready, check," James said, for probably the 100th time. As he did so, he unzipped his bag and pulled out the bottle of enchanted coffee that each of them had brought along. "Grossed out but ready here," Sarah said, downing her own brew already. "Objectively more grossed out," Daniel added. "But I'm good. This is where they challenge us, right?" "Maybe," James said. "If we're lucky, it's empty, and we'll have the red to buy our way out. If not, we're going to have to fight. If we're half and half, then one of them is going to threaten us but not stop us." Them, in this case, were the rat roaches. Bipedal, with a third arm placed somewhere depending on what dice they'd rolled at character creation, they were covered in a patchwork of mangy fur and rough beetle shell chitin, and so far every one of them the Order had come across had been fanatically devoted to the act of killing for the dungeon that they saw as some kind of god. As they stepped forward into the arena, James hissed out an angry breath as he saw dozens of the things lining the walls. This last chamber had a floor of asphalt gravel. It was the size and dimensions of a basketball court, but it didn't stop at the edges. Instead, a rusted chain-link fence rose up around the outside, and beyond it, dozens of silently observant rat roaches watched the trio walk forward. Well, silent in that they didn't speak or hiss or whatever noise their species usually produced. They did rattle the various jagged blades and rough clubs they had against the fence, though. At the end of the chamber, a warped iron gate covered a small hallway that led to a single door. The door was blue, with the paint only a little bit chipped, just a normal-looking metal security door that happened to look exactly like the one they'd entered by. It even had a fluorescent light overhead that bathed it in white light, looking positively divine compared to everything else in this hell pit. A couple of fairly mundane-looking lockers set nearby, too, half melted into the concrete but otherwise intact. James knew that those would only open with the requisite number of green sparks to feed them, just as the metal grate wouldn't be moved without enough red. A single rat roach stood in the center of the court. Cream-colored fur with speckles of brown mushrooms growing out of it, its extra arm extended out the elbow on its right side, giving it something akin to the look of a pincer. Each of its hands on that side held a knife in a low position, idly flipping the blades over in its three-fingered hands. As James, Sarah, and Daniel spread out on the court ahead of it, coffee burning in their veins alongside the adrenaline of the coming fight, it raised a fist over its head, and the rattling and thumping around them ceased. "You!" The rat roach drooled out the word in a voice that was worryingly recognizable as feminine. "Bring us a prayer to the Maker." Her voice rose as she spoke, turning side to side to address not just the Delvers but the crowd as well. A chittering series of cheers answered her as she screamed words into the still air of the arena. "I promise you we do not," James said, his voice firm and projected loudly through his face mask. He shook his head at the rat roach as he stepped forward into the middle of the trio's wedge. "Get out of the way," he ordered the creature. "No, no!" The pale rat roach hissed a laugh at him, the noise bubbling through its muzzle. "One last prayer you have for us." Prayer? James, why is... "Not interested." He cut Sarah off. "I'm ranking your religion shortly below Jehovah's Witnesses in terms of how much I don't want you coming to my house." James bit out the words. "Now get out of our way. We have no interest in sacrificing each other to open the door, but if we need more blood, we can always come back for yours." The rat roach chuckled, spraying acidic spittle onto the floor as it doubled over, clutching its chest in a strange, inhuman parody of a laugh. "No!" It drew the word out, and the Delvers flinched and closed ranks as the rat roaches around them echoed the laughter. "It is an exaltation!" It bellowed the words, mangled as they were through its twisted throat, and then, without any further warning, lowered its arms to a boxer's stance and flung itself across the floor of the arena toward James. And it was fast, very fast, faster than he'd expected from every one of these things that the Order had put down in the past. But being tempered in constant combat and dungeon exploration had given James a healthy paranoia, and a habit of making sure that the coffee that enhanced his reflexes to inhuman levels was taken before the fight started. One of the rat roach's bone knives flashed down from overhead, the creature already having closed the gap. James caught it on the bracer of his armor, eyes going wide as the blade sunk an inch into it and rasped against the skin underneath, but it failed to draw blood. And when the thing brought its opposite fist up to try to uppercut him, James matched the blow with his own closed fist. Rat roaches were, for all that they were willing to die in bloody, spiteful droves, not built as well as a human body was. And when James's fist clashed against his enemy's wrist, one of them was using a compact missile of flesh and bone, and the other one was cursed with a poorly assembled limb that shattered under the attack. The rat roach swept its other knife in a crescent arc toward James' throat, but he leaned back just enough to let it sweep past without touching him. Then he lurched forward again, dropping a stomping kick onto the monster's ankle while he brought his forearm up again to absorb another knife strike. The rat roach hissed at him, droplets of acidic saliva splattering onto his face and making James glad he'd kept the mask on. Pulling on the knowledge of multiple martial arts orbs, he slipped forward into its guard and shouldered it back under the jaw. A rapid series of punches before the rat roach could react caved in parts of its stomach and rib cage. And then James jetted backward, multiple different magical sources making him faster than a human probably should be. "Yes!" the rat roach wailed, even as it vomited up its own blood onto the floor, the voice sounding less like a creature in pain and more like the thing was drowning in pleasure. Then it lunged forward again, arms coming together to try to wrap James in an embrace. Daniel hit it in the side of the head, knocking it off course as he slugged the creature. Then, having circled around it from behind, Sarah landed a hook kick on it that caved its flesh in around her boot and sent the rat roach sprawling to the ground, the knives it was holding pinwheeling through the air as it lost its grip. James caught one of them in mid-flight, pivoted into a pitcher's stance, and flung it at full speed into the creature's chest. The blade half cut into a patch of skin where it met chitin and opened up a gash in the rat roach before bouncing across the floor beyond it. The monster lay there, dripping in its own blood and drool, staring up at the grimly lit ceiling of the room, chest heaving with ragged breaths that it took, but it made no move to rise. James stood a yard or two away in a rough circle around it with Sarah and Daniel, trading looks over the body. Around them, the rat roaches encircling the arena seemed to be holding their breaths, not a sound from the crowd of dozens of the creatures. "We're leaving," James announced. "Sarah, Daniel, get the door." He let them run ahead, and then turned to keep an eye on their downed foe. "Ah, fuck," he muttered as the rat roach started to push itself up, blood running red lines through its pale fur. "Good," it coughed out. Yes, good prayer." The light in its eyes danced in joy, even as it had to suck in ragged breaths just to get the mangled words out. "Next time. Again," it gasped, settling itself onto its hands and knees, prostrate on the jagged rocks of the floor. James looked at it, the adrenaline of the fight not having fully faded from his blood. Even though the coffee and enchantments made it so he wasn't really in much danger, the feeling of having something try to drive sharpened bone into your eye wasn't really pleasant, and in that moment he had a sudden thought. He should probably just kill this thing. What possible good would come from leaving it alive? The last time he left an enemy alive, it came back and shot his friends. It would take about 6 seconds to stomp this thing's throat into paste, and that would solve a problem forever. No risk that it would end up eating some random kid that fell into this place. No risk it would sneak out and try to murder James or his family while it slept. He took a halting step forward. That was the point, wasn't it? He'd won. Again. Every time someone tried to kill him, he survived and won. His reward should be a feeling of safety, and he wasn't going to get that if he kept trying to play nice. What was the point of surviving if no one ever tried to do better except for him? James yanked the knife out of his armor where it had been buried and took another step. The rat roach raised its eyes to look at him, and he got the sickening sense it knew what he was thinking and was thrilled by it. He sighed and tossed the knife off to the side of the makeshift basketball court. "You know," he said softly, crouching down in front of the rat roach, "I'm not really in the position to kink shame anyone." "James!" Sarah called over, a rattling of metal accompanying her words. "Let's go!" "Don't eat anyone until I get back," James ordered the rat roach as he stood up. It looked at him with glee in its faceted eyes and nodded its triangular head in obedience before slumping back to lie prone in its own blood. The green sparks they had were enough to crack several lockers. They made it out of there with a water-damaged romance novel, a Cliff Notes version of some Shakespeare play, a biology textbook, 2 spiral notebooks, and something James was pretty sure was a German copy of one of the Harry Potter books that had been highly defaced. Each of the delvers picked one as they made their way through the blue metal door and past where Lua was sitting to keep watch. It dropped them out right where they started. James offered a book to Lua as well, and she accepted it. Each of them knew the value of having a little extra edge, which left the romance novel and a spiral notebook to be tested out with the magic copier power, just to see if they could start to spread the stat upgrades from this place into the whole of the Order as part of their loadout package. One by one, different delvers opened different books that they'd chosen. Either minutes or hours later, subjectively, James looked up again from what he was reading, the physical object of the book fading into dust that itself faded down into something smaller until it faded into nothing and was gone from reality. And then, in the back of his head, a thought that he had been waiting for. Lesson begun. Biology, 0 out of 200. Lesson continues. Basketball, 64 out of 1200. He looked around at the other 3 members of the Order and asked the obvious question. What y'all got? U.S. history, Daniel said, a little disappointed. I don't like history, damn it. I'll link you a YouTube channel, James promised. Sarah? Art! I finally got art! She exclaimed with delight. Finally? Wait, how many of these have you used? Lua asked her. I have been watching the door the whole time. She glanced between the entrance to the dungeon and the young woman doing a small shuffling dance in the hallway. Also, I got geometry. Does it not tell you what you get for completing it? Not until your first upgrade, James said sadly, unbuckling the damaged and dripping pieces of his armor. Daniel, empty your bag into mine. Let's use yours to store all the gross stuff. Aw, no, Daniel started to protest, until he was assured they would be burning the bag afterward anyway and he would never have to carry it with them again. After that, stripped as much of the mess as they could manage, the 3 of them said quick goodbyes to Lua with a promise to meet up again at the lair to discuss what had changed. According to her, they'd been in there for about 20 minutes, not the 3 or 4 hours that they'd experienced, but it would still be prudent to vacate school grounds before anyone got suspicious of them. FBI or not, there was no sense pushing the limits of their cover. In the car, on the way back to the lair, where James was given to understand someone had installed a hot shower in the basement, the 3 of them finally started to relax. Well, that was super fucked up, Daniel exclaimed. I think I hate that place. Agreed, Sarah nodded. Hey, James, you're still on about building that arcology thing, right? Constantly. We're working on figuring out a few main things before we lay foundations, though, and I mean that metaphorically, not literally. Why? Well, I'm just thinking, if you can get Momo to magic up some kind of portal, we could just connect it to the sewer, and then we can use it as a sewage dump, and no one will worry or care. James opened his mouth to explain that doing that might be unethical, or mean to the life that lived in the Akashic sewer, or just might annoy the dungeon, or any number of other problems. But then he remembered the smell that still clung to his clothes and hair and was filling the car. Thought about the sensation of slimy fingers and ragged fur trying to rip him apart, and checked his count of how many kids the place had killed in the last year alone. Yeah, okay, he settled on. I feel like at this point, literally shitting on that place is probably a fair response.